I was reflecting the other day that there's a very strong correlation between decades where men's hairstyles were really terrible and also decades where architecture was really terrible, and also decades where you saw a lot of political radicalism and ferment. And I think it's not a coincidence, actually. I think they come out of the same thing, which is a desire for subversion's sake.
Thank you, Louise, for coming to the Dominion of Canada. I know for a Voices That Inspire series, you've certainly inspired me, so it's very fitting indeed. I think Peter just gave us the most succinct of definitions of the sexual revolution, but perhaps we could dive right in on that idea. Over some time, you have competing definitions. You have people who refer to sexual revolutions, plural. And I wonder if you could flesh out a little bit, if you would, for us, what the sexual revolution is and how you define it.
So I suppose it's two things. One is the material changes to men's and women's lives that occurred from the mid-20th century onwards, really. The one that I'm most interested in is the pill. But there were a whole, as Phyllis Schlafly famously said, that the washing machine did more for women than feminism ever did. The washing machine was really important alongside all the other domestic technologies that emerge around that time and make the work of keeping the home clean, warm and fed easier. And so you see an influx of women into the workplace. I mean, I really do think that that's like most of the story is actually to do with the ability to reliably sever sex from reproduction emerges with reliable contraception, and the work of the housewife reduces, not the childcare. The childcare doesn't get less time consuming, it kind of doesn't, but the other stuff gets less time consuming. But there's also the ideological story, which emerges at the same time, and you have these very radical ideas about sex, about everything, really. It's a great mystery and very interesting sociological mystery as to why so much radicalism was birthed from the 60s in everything. It's the idea that men should have a short back and sides, that's outdated nonsense. We need to rebel against that. The idea that buildings should be symmetrical, that's ridiculous, we should, etc. I think that mood that comes out of this period is, I don't exactly know where it comes from, honestly. It's probably got something to do with the trauma of the Second World War and of very rapid technological change, sort of unsteadying people. It also occurs at the same time as de-Christianization. The sexual revolution is part of that bundle, and it's that feeling of traditional ideas about sex and about relationships and marriage and everything are all up for debate and in fact merit subversion.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the radicalism of the 60s. That means for plenty of us in this room, we've never known a world that wasn't swimming in the waters of the sexual revolution, if I put it that way. I do remember as a much younger woman being asked, I was a journalist at the time, I was asked the question of when did I reject the sexual revolution. I wasn't that young, arguably I ought to have known better, but all I found myself thinking as I sort of stuttered was there was a revolution and I'm supposed to have rejected it. This is what is packed into that question. And I wonder if you find today as you speak about these issues, are young people who you talk to aware of a sexual revolution? Are you introducing them to it? Could they identify that there has been this break in sexual mores and that things are different today? Or do we all need to learn as I do over many years of reading and following your podcast?
Well, it's all been very highly propagandized, which makes it sort of difficult for young people to discern what the pre-sexual revolution world might have been like. I mean, just the use of the expression "the 1950s," for instance, this is a very powerful expression, which is normally accompanied by "we must not return to," right? Occasionally, it's used as a model that we should emulate, but generally, it's something very fearful, and that can be powerful in popular culture. The downsides of the 1950s are regularly represented, whereas, say, the political violence of the 1970s has been mostly forgotten. I read this morning, my friend Ed West, who's a British journalist, he wrote a great essay for his Substack about political violence in America in particular. And apparently between 1971 and 1972, there was an 18-month period where there were 5 bombings a day in mainland United States. And almost no one knows that. So, I mean, maybe it's just me, I don't know. I didn't know that.
I know that because I read the same Ed West article.
Okay, there we go. But that whole, and let's say the violence of the Weather Underground or Black Panthers or any of these, that's just not represented popularly. You don't, Angela Davis is fated. She was just recently given an honorary doctorate by Cambridge University. That whole, I mean, there is enormous power in what you see on TV. Mm-hmm. And the sexual revolution, I think, has been very clearly represented as a massive win, particularly for women. Right. And what happened before was terrible, and we must never return to it. And that, I think, that message has been mostly received loud and clear by young people. Although, having said that, I think that actually there's a significant I think there is more skepticism now among Zoomers, and more Zoomers are moving to the right, particularly boys or young men. And I do wonder to what extent that's because these are the children of the divorced generation who've actually grown up. It's harder to persuade the children of broken families that the sexual revolution was an unalloyed good.
Yeah, actually that is a sort of corollary question that I wanted to ask around victimization of the sexual revolution. If young people cannot identify that there was a sexual revolution, might they be acquainted with becoming victims of it in some fashion, or would you see that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many people would know that, say, I'm not sure exactly what statistics are in Canada. I think they're similar, but I know that in London, where I grew up, half of children will reach the age of 15 not living with their biological father. And that is not historically normal. And I don't know how many of those children know that it's not historically normal, but it seems like it seems important to tell people that it isn't, to situate ourselves within a longer historical narrative that doesn't just see this as the way things have always been, because it's not the way things have always been.
True, and that can often be comforting to those who are struggling with something they think is normal but isn't. When we talk about the sexual revolution, I think it's intimately related with the term feminism, and I think it may be possible, do you agree, that feminism and the sexual revolution are often correlated? So where people are hugely supportive of the sexual revolution, are they perhaps confusing it with feminism? Feminism, of course, is its own contested term. The question I have for you is whether feminism created the sexual revolution, and does it now perpetuate it? And are these two things partnering together, or are they completely separate?
They are certainly bundled together. I mean, just in terms of the sequence of events with the sexual revolution of the 60s, the women's movement, as it was called, emerged sometime after the pill was made widely available, and Playboy became an important cultural touchstone and so on. There was actually a significant lag. And in some ways, the women's movement was actually a response to, there's that whole strain of the second wave, which has been somewhat forgotten, the anti-porn, anti-casual sex, etc. strain, which was in some sense reacting to the chauvinism of the 60s, which women didn't like. So it's complicated, right? And I think that the definition of feminism, which I think is the most useful, Holly Lawford-Smith, who's an Australian philosopher I interviewed recently, she's written a whole book about this. Basically, is it possible to be feminist and right-wing? That's the question that Holly engages with. And she concludes yes, by having a loose definition of feminism, which is basically a political movement that is interested in the interests of women qua women. And that can look like all sorts of things. I've already mentioned Phyllis Schlafly. Holly concludes that Phyllis Schlafly was a feminist. She wouldn't have called herself that, obviously, but in the sense that what she was interested in was defending the interests of women qua women. And she saw campaigning against the Equal Rights Amendment as doing exactly that. And yeah, I mean, this is a long history that predates the second wave and indeed the first wave. And there's this whole tranche of feminist history which has been just as memory hold as the Weather Underground, right? Erika Bacchiocci, who's a Catholic American academic and friend of mine, she's so good on digging out this like early, she's written a book on Mary Wollstonecraft and digging out the early history of feminism, which was pro-life, right? That's a whole area of feminism that's been completely forgotten. Feminism was by default pro-life up until really recently.
That's definitely been forgotten.
Yeah. And had a much more, saw the sexes in a much more complementary relationship, prized the domestic and motherhood much more generally than feminism does now. So, I mean, this is a long and complicated intellectual history. Mm-hmm. And I have somewhat tongue-in-cheek adopted Mary Harrington's term reactionary feminist, partly because it's funny, and partly because I would like to resurrect that older intellectual history and not give over this word to a strain of feminist thought, which I don't think does promote the interests of women.
Right. Right-wing feminists haven't been really wholeheartedly welcomed into feminism, I think in no small part because from my read of a lot of the literature, feminism is quite closely associated with Marxism and socialism. But just to continue that strain of conversation, how does feminism interact with, say, Marxism, socialism on the one end, but also liberalism on the other end? Yeah. Yes, and how they interact, I think, pertains to how women who might be more conservative could be included.
Yeah, so the type of feminism that most undergraduates say will be encountering on campuses now, in Canada and elsewhere, is quite heavily Marxist. I mean, the whole progressive worldview, I think, is extremely Marxist, and actually probably should just be understood as, I think these movements should just be understood as contiguous, like what we call wokeness now, or progressivism, or whatever. I mean, I think it's just Marxism with slightly different emphases. It's the idea being that there is this oppressor-oppressed dynamic, and of course the feminist iteration of that just slots men and women into those roles, and then sees women as always and everywhere in the oppressed role, and men as always and everywhere in the oppressor role, which I don't accept as true. I mean, my view is that the reason why feminism ought to exist is because the nature of women's reproductive role, the fact that we are the ones who bear children and primarily look after them when they're little, means that women are always at a disadvantage in terms of ability to participate in political life and in public life. And moreover, that certain psychological and personality differences between men and women that I've written about mean that women have a tendency to be to be more agreeable than men, to be less assertive than men, to be less likely to voice their own needs as a sex. And I think that if feminism exists to do anything, it's to try and counteract that effect. Mm-hmm. It's to try and make up for the fact that women are less likely to be in the corridors of power and are less likely to be heard within those corridors if they are there. Mm-hmm. So just in a really basic sense, I think that's why feminism ought to exist. That doesn't mean, I think, that we have to sign up for the Marxist model.
Right. This may seem like something of a silly question, but I do want to ask you a bit about your audience for Maiden Mother Matriarch, which says a lot in a podcast name, and I commend the podcast to you.
Choose a mouthful. It was maybe a mistake.
MMM. But is your audience largely women? Do you find men are tuning in as well? And, you know, Maiden Mother Matriarch, what is it that you aim to encapsulate in that podcast name?
It's mostly women, but you might be surprised by how many men listen. I do have all this data at my fingertips. I can tell you that my modal listener is a woman in her 30s and 40s who has kids. But there is a wide range in terms of age and sex and location and everything. How did I come up with the name? There's this, the other way of saying this is Maiden Mother Crone, but that doesn't have as nice alliterative effect. No. I think it comes from sort of English folklore, this idea of the stages of a woman's life defined by her, not just her age, but her marital and her reproductive status. And an idea that I alighted on a good while ago before I started the podcast was that women's lives are much more segmented generally than men's are by reproduction. And the assumption that we ought to follow the male life path often leads us into trouble because we assume, for instance, that we can have careers exactly as men do, and then we discover that that's incompatible with motherhood, and then you either have to opt out of having children or perhaps completely reassess your life. And actually what seems to be much more common in reality with how women deal with this problem, and I think this ought to be spoken about more, is to have a more segmented life. You know, you have a period where maybe you do one career as a maiden and then you don't do paid work as a mother, or you do part-time or something, and then you do a whole other career when you enter your matriarch phase. And anecdotally, I know of lots of women who've done that very successfully. Mm-hmm. And it's a way in which men and women's lives can be different, but not in a negative way and not in a hierarchical way, mm-hmm. Which I think is good.
Indeed, yes. I'm looking forward to the matriarch phase. I somehow think that's going to be filled with fewer pressures of the kind that mothers who do waged work or don't feel.
I do hear this. I hear it's something to look forward to.
Yeah, no, I also picture myself sitting on a porch with a stick at some point. That's like long ways down. Anyways, you spoke earlier about the technological shock of the pill, the birth control pill. It is definitively part of this conversation. It's not terribly popular to talk about. I just wondered if you could expand on that and how this technological shock shifted the sexual ethic. And then we'll leave it at that for now, but moving on from there, were there other technological shocks that also worked to change the sexual ethic dramatically? But first, the pill. And how did it do that?
So the pill socially separated sex from reproduction. Of course, it didn't actually separate sex from reproduction, not least because the earliest versions of the pill, and this is still true, were quite unreliable. And so, I mean, it's a very good lesson in how humans are complicated, in that you would think if you introduced some technology that made it much less likely that a woman would get pregnant, that you would see fewer pregnancies and fewer unwanted pregnancies and fewer abortions, and you saw the precise opposite of that. And I think the reason is because the absolute amount of premarital and extramarital sex went up a lot because of that social severing of sex and reproduction. And so inevitably you have lots more people having sex in situations where they don't want to be getting pregnant, and then say 1% of the time the woman does get pregnant, then that's going to lead either to abortion or illegitimacy, or all of the social phenomena that we're familiar with in the post-sexual revolution era. So yeah, I mean, a lesson there in the hubris of assuming you can know what any kind of technology is going to do to a system as complex human society. One of the big things that happened after the pill was introduced is that the shotgun wedding basically disappeared within about a decade. The expression that I've used, it isn't my coinage, I can't remember who first said this or wrote this, but when the pill made an abortion, made motherhood a biological choice for women, it made fatherhood a social choice for men, in that men suddenly felt able to say, well, hang on, when we had sex, I wasn't signing up for the possibility of fatherhood. I was under the impression that the pill precluded that possibility, and now you're telling me that actually you're pregnant, not my problem. And the shotgun wedding just disappeared because that social pressure wasn't there anymore. I mean, it did co-occur, as we've talked about, with dechristianization and all of these other factors which would have made the traditional marriage model less strong. But yeah, I mean, technology is a risky business.
What other technological shocks might you see in our era today? I mean, I don't think this is a technology, but the internet has brought widespread pervasive pornography to each home. There are other factors that have they worked equally strongly as the pill? Pill's really the starting shock, but are there others that rival it, really?
Well, the internet is a big one, right? And it's kind of difficult, because we're in the middle of it, it's difficult to see how that's played out. I mean, my impression is it's made the battle of the sexes a lot worse. And it's significantly increased antagonism between men and women. I wonder if some of that is to do with the fact that social media in particular exposes a lot of private conversations that ought to remain private, and that both men and women are suddenly, it's the normal and natural thing to do is for the sexes to segregate a fair bit socially, and women will have private conversations with women, and men will have the kind of locker room talk, private conversations with men, and everyone doesn't have full knowledge of what goes on in those homosocial spaces, and that's fine. One of the things that social media does is it immediately exposes all of those conversations, and you discover just how crude men can be about women, and you discover just how unpleasant women can be about men and about each other. And I don't know, I think maybe there was a lifting of a veil that ought not to have been lifted. That's just one example, but I think that the internet has probably done no good.
I'm sort of surprised often with women a lot younger than me how they might view sharing some of these things that I might view as being private, as they would view the sharing almost as therapeutic, and it's encouraged. And so Bell, let's talk mental health. That's not strictly speaking the sexual revolution in action, but it's a huge day here, and people will talk about things that, you know, the audience isn't necessarily concerned for their well-being when people express those things. Antagonism is a word you used, as it's developed between the sexes. That's something I encounter a lot in my work, that young men and young women will ask about, particularly as regards marriage, but simply that they can't get married because they can't meet anyone, and the levels of antagonism have risen. I wonder if you could remark upon the effects of the sexual revolution on the sexes, first men and then women, and how that looks in the relationships that we are trying to form.
So matchmaking is quite a tricky coordination problem, as it turns out, and most societies have I guess tried and tested means of trying to solve that problem more or less successfully, including actual matchmakers. For instance, I did an interview for my podcast recently with a woman called Christiana Maxion, who's a matchmaker to the 1%. She works in Dubai, and all of her clients are exclusively wealthy people. And it was actually fascinating because she's ended up learning so much about what men and women are like from doing this job. Admittedly, very rich men and women, but still. But that's rare now. There are plenty of societies where having matchmakers is actually quite quite normal. It's kind of built into the system. And having, I don't know, chaperones and dancers and all these other things that that young women now swoon over in Jane Austen and are just not a feature of contemporary society. They have Tinder instead, like much worse. So yeah, there is a significant coordination problem. I think that people actually need a lot more help with finding spouses than they are currently offered. They need a lot more family guidance and community support of various kinds, whether that be shoving the eligible young people in each other's way at a family do, or offering opinions on choices of partner. I do also think, though, so the book I'm writing at the moment, slowly because I've had two children in the meanwhile, is about birth rates and why birth rates have fallen. And it's common for people to attribute this problem to the coordination problem of matchmaking. The people aren't finding the right partner at the right time, and there's this quite narrow biological window, and if you don't get everything in sequence, then children don't get born. And in some ways that's true, and like anecdotally probably the most, that if you ask anyone, particularly someone in their 20s or 30s, why birth rates are falling and why they personally haven't had children if they haven't, they will say one of two things. They'll say, I haven't found the right spouse, the right person to have them with, and children are too expensive. The problem with that latter explanation is that there's a very, very strong correlation between how rich a country is and how low its birth rate is. And the poorest countries in the world have the highest birth rates, and often very poor. We are all descended from people who had 10 children in one-room huts, so like it doesn't really work historically. And the problem with the former explanation is that very few people are like unmarriageable, like really could not find a partner. I mean, even felons will find girlfriends like without too much difficulty, right?
That was not lost on me when I was single for so long and not in prison,
Yes, but what's really going on when people say I can't find the right partner is they say I can't find the person who meets my expectations in various ways, and so part of the story is that now women have economic independence because they can work, and they are allowed to have credit cards and own property and all these things that came out of the second wave. And therefore women don't need to lower their standards in order to have a husband because they don't need to be economically supported by him. So some of it is women just having more choices. And some of it is also us just having different ideas about what partnership should be, that it's not just about having a co-parent and a someone with whom you have an economic relationship, as in the past. It's someone with whom you have not just a deeply companionate relationship, but also it can be a vehicle for self-expression, and a sort of cherry on the cake in terms of your life achievement, getting married to somebody. And people in the past didn't think about marriage in that way. They just had lower expectations. And so when people say the birth rate is falling because people aren't not hooking up, but matching up with long-term partners, it's actually just a longer way of saying people don't want to have children that much. Because if people wanted to have children, if they had a really strong desire to have children, they'd find a way.
So are women too picky, or did the sexual revolution create a climate where there are fewer marriageable men?
So in terms of like these kind of left tail effects with men, right? Like men who are not just unemployed but unemployable, or men who are in and out of prison. Well, I mean, again, having said that, like the men who are in and out of prison or have other like bad left tail scenarios, they're not getting married, but they are having children quite often, just not within that setting. So I don't want to sound like I'm scolding women for not marrying men who would make their lives like significantly worse, particularly women who do have economic independence and do have other options. Like I'm not the ability that women have to not be forced by subsistence conditions into living with men who are terrible and who might be alcoholics or beat them or any of these things, that's such a win from feminism. Like, that's really, really important and so precious. And I don't want to undo that. I think that the reason that's also like quite uncommon. That's not really that's not the demise of marriage does not come down to those left out outliers. It comes down to a much bigger cultural change.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about that. That's actually a perfect segue to an avenue of conversation that I did want to pursue. Marriage rates are indeed on the decline, and living together is on the rise. And the question for you is, are these largely cultural phenomena, or is there a role for law, policy, and the state? And so where do you find that line for deeply personal, private issues like marriage, how we choose to live, and also at the same time wanting to encourage social stability? Are these cultural issues purely, or is there a role for law and public policy in the state?
Well, the state has to make decisions around this, maybe unfortunately. But when we determine, if you are going to have a state and have things like taxation, you have to determine how you tax households, for instance. And if you tax households as individual adults, and are blind to the existence of children within the household, or whether you tax couples, or whether you have personal allowances for every member of the household, including the children, etc., you do have to choose something. So it isn't possible for the state to be completely neutral on this question. States do recognise the existence of marriages, so what does that actually mean in practice? These are questions we have to engage with. Which is not to say that the state has an enormous amount of power on this question. I think a lot of it does. I was interested to learn that in Canada, cohabitation rates are significantly higher in Quebec compared with the rest of Canada, as in France.
Compared with the rest of the world, in fact, yeah.
As in France, which also has high rates of cohabitation. So that does suggest that there are some deep cultural roots to some of these phenomena to do with religion. I mean, and also Canada has low birth rates, like low compared with the Anglosphere, significantly lower than Britain and a lot lower than America. I mean, until recently, America had quite high birth rates for a Western country. That's less true now, but I'm sure that is mostly to do with religiosity.
Is the state responsible for bringing down marriage rates, do you think? Have there been policies at play that have actually decreased the ability of families to form?
Yeah, well, you can imagine a scenario where the state was extremely authoritarian and said, I don't know, children born out of wedlock are denied certain civil rights or something like that. Like there is a scenario where the state could have been extremely, could have resisted the fall in marriage rates, but not really within the Overton window, and that hasn't happened in any Western country. I think that no-fault divorce is a mistake. I don't think that should be. I think that if you're getting divorced, it's because someone's at fault. Like in cases where divorce is the right choice, there are cases where divorce is the right choice. I think even the strongest proponent of marriage will concede that. In cases of, say, domestic violence or other types of abuse, someone's at fault, and the court should be able to discern that.
Would you see, this is deeply unpopular, but would you like to see governments repealing no-fault divorce?
Yeah, and also there's research suggesting that even when, and this is about, again, it's like going back to the unexpected consequences of the pill, a human society is a complex thing. And so even in societies, where, even for couples who do not get divorced, no fault or otherwise, living within a divorce culture where divorce is very common is it affects those marriages. And in my first book, I cited research on, for instance, when no fault divorce was passed in various American states, because it happened at different times. There's evidence that married couples became less committed to one another. Like they would be less likely to support a spouse through study or to financially invest in the relationship, because there was this kind of vague, diffuse, but important sense that marriages were less permanent because it was so easy to opt out of them. Like it's easier to get out of a marriage than it is to get out of a loan.
Yeah, it's the easiest contract to break. Well, on that note then, so Louise Perry as British PM or Canadian Prime Minister would attempt to repeal no-fault divorce. I'm wondering, do you have other ideas on what a positive vision for family policy is? And what would your first step, I've just anointed you Prime Minister of this country, what would your first step on family policy be?
I do think we should tax families differently. I believe Canada has the same system as in Britain, where you're taxed as an individual, you're not taxed as a family. In contrast to, say, Germany, where each member of the household has a personal allowance, which is untaxed. So if you're a family of four, you don't pay. So in Britain, the personal allowance is £12,500. So if you're a family of four, you wouldn't pay tax on the first £50,000 of household income. And the more children you had, the higher that threshold would be. And again, this is a very frustrating example of this move towards taxing individual workers was a feminist win. It was pushed for by, like very explicitly, by feminist activists as a way of encouraging women to work, or rather discouraging women from being stay-at-home wives and mothers. And unfortunately, it has meant that it has made it more financially difficult to be a stay-at-home wife and mother, which actually so the survey data generally shows that a small number of women always put career before family, a small number of women never want to earn any money at all, they want to be entirely financially dependent on their husband. Much more common in the middle is kind of this segmented life thing where you will have periods where you're part-time, and but those women in the middle, they want to spend more time at home with their young children. They don't want to have children in 70 hours of daycare a week or whatever it is in order to do the really demanding career. And when tax policy pushes women into returning to the workforce as quickly as possible after having a baby, those women are harmed. You don't even have to think that daycare is bad for children. I mean, I think on balance it is a bit bad for children. I don't think that it's not that strong, the evidence, but like it's a bit bad, all else being equal. But also it's so common for women to feel desperately sad and trapped when they feel like they have to put their child in daycare and return to work as quickly as possible in order to feed the taxation engine,
Yeah.
Because the work that they're doing at home is invisible to the government. It just doesn't show up in GDP figures.
Yeah, and on that note, caring policy in general, in Canada there is a push. This is part of the state pushing putting their thumb on the scales really, and funding a particular choice that the state enjoys, but may not in fact actually support families. So at the childcare end, that's true. Also, other areas include elder care and palliative care in Canada. There's a shortage of workers for elder care, and palliative care is not widely available. How is it that we can change the policies on caring to improve them for the state of the family?
there has to be some way of making that work visible to the governments, because it has enormous. If you try to add up how much it's worth, it would be enormously valuable in terms of the, if all of the care work done by men and women, but it is more often women, were given an hourly wage value, it would be such an enormous contribution to the economy, but of course it isn't. And also there are other ways. It's not even just that hourly, per hour of elder care, per hour of childcare. It's also there's a social fabric that the stay-at-home wife and mother contributes to. I'm sure this is true in Canada as well, but in Britain it's quite common to have playgroups, as we call them, where you rent out a church hall or something cheaply, and you show up once a week with your baby or toddler, and the babies play and the mums have tea, and it has nothing to do with the state, and it has nothing to do with the market, because it's not profit making. You just pay for the small fee for whatever it costs to put them on. It's an area of civil society which is completely outside of those two things and so valuable. But I've always noticed from taking my children to these things that the people who run them are overwhelmingly middle-aged and older women who are of that generation and probably of that class strata as well, who didn't have to have careers, who could stay at home and become very involved in their communities, and are available on a Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. to show up and do all of this. And they're providing, because the mums don't have time, right? The mums of the young children, they're in the trenches, they don't have time. So it's these women who are a bit older, and they are contributing so much to their community. And if they were to disappear, there would be a real loss, but it wouldn't be an obvious loss, and it wouldn't be a financial loss, and it wouldn't be one that really mattered to government.
No, indeed. I thought you were going to say they're doing so much for mothers' sanity. But
that too.
That too.
Yeah, which has a price, I guess, but this is this urge that governments have towards trying to quantify things that can't be quantified.
Indeed. Between state and culture, then, how is it that we can have a proposition where family life becomes attractive again? Because in Canada today, one might argue it is not. It has not.
I guess it's a different question. The question of how do we encourage people to have more children, which I guess is a little bit different. I've been forced to become somewhat pessimistic on that by looking at the results of experiments with perinatal policy in places like Hungary and South Korea, where they have generally been disappointing. There's been a slight nudge in terms of how many people have children, in terms of the birth rate, but not that much. The counterfactual would be maybe it would have fallen further. It's not, but it's very expensive. Hungary have put a lot of money into these policies and haven't got much in the way of a birth rate boost as a consequence. My suspicion, at least when it comes to birth rates, which is different from marriage and other family policy questions, but related, is that there's something much, much deeper about modernity, which is disincentivizing people from having children. What that is, I have various theories, but it might be beyond the scope of this evening to go through them. But
these questions they're not simple questions.
No, they're really not. And actually, anyone who tells you that they absolutely know why birth rates are falling, they're wrong. No
Don't
one
believe them.
Knows. Yeah, it's actually so much more mysterious and complicated than most people realize.
Switching gears just a little bit, it's you're already on to another book. You're writing about fertility specifically, I believe. But going back to the case against the sexual revolution, I'm wondering, since that came out in 2022, if there's anything you look back and have changed your opinion on, or would you issue any kind of a correction for something that you put in that book?
I would probably, I have said this elsewhere, but I think what I advised in the book was for women in particular, to wait 6 months into a relationship before having sex. I didn't say the obvious traditional thing, which is to wait until you get married. And I felt like that was too strong. That was too countercultural to say that. I think I would probably be a little bit braver now. But also, to be fair, it wasn't silly of me to be cautious.
No, indeed, you want to have an audience of readers who can...
Yeah, exactly. Don't just dismiss me as a crank. I think maybe now I can embrace my crankishness a little bit more. But
now that would be possible. On sexual ethic then, and yes, indeed, waiting till marriage to have sex would be countercultural in both of our countries in the extreme. But when we talk about relationship between the sexes and the sexual revolution, it's extremely important, I think, not to just simply be against the sexual revolution, but really to propose something to young people that might offer them something. So what would you offer young people by way of a positive relationship building, life-giving sexual ethic?
Christianity. I mean, there needs to be, like, if we've learned anything from the experiment of the last 100 years, it's that people have a desperate desire for ideologies that offer meaning and that offer quite clear directives. And people really, really struggle with our religion, and they'll find ways, they'll replace it in some fashion, and I think they almost always replace it with something worse, particularly politics. And politics makes for a very bad God. And I mean, the good thing about Christianity is that it does offer a completely cohesive, self-contained philosophy and worldview, which has not just lasted 2,000 years, but has also created some of the most impressive societies in the history of the world. And so that's something, that's a recommendation, isn't it? Whereas I feel like if you're trying to design some new ideology on your lonesome, the chances of succeeding are pretty minimal.
When I first began following your work, I was already a Christian. I viewed you as a secular feminist, and it provided a really important backup to some of the ideas that I held dear. And it gave that rational aura to some of the religious convictions that I hold, which are also firmly rational. However, people tend not to view it that way. Mm-hmm. I recently heard you tell Peter Copeland on the MLI podcast that you've become a Christian, and I wondered if you expect that to change anything in how your research goes and how your message is received.
I'll have dialed the crankiness kind of public image up. Yes, I mean, I think that it is, as you say, there isn't a conflict between being rational and being, and I think I said this to Peter, for me, actually, this sounds so nerdy, but actually looking at research and data convinced me that Christianity is sociologically true in the sense that it creates good outcomes, and actually, not just generally, I mean, absolutely the ways in which Christianity directs people to live their lives, makes their lives better. And it might be a coincidence, but if it were true supernaturally, you would expect it to be sociologically true as well. Mm-hmm. And I take that as actually very compelling evidence. So I think you can be actually you don't have to say people ought to do this because it's what the Bible says. I mean, apart from anything else, the Bible can be quite hard to interpret. You can say, doing this, monogamous marriage, let's say, doing this has, for a very long time, proved to be the best way of living your life. And incidentally, the Bible does also tell you to do it. But I think I think it will, I hope it will, despite being a public Christian, secular people will still be willing to listen to arguments that are rooted in rationalism and in data. And also there's probably a revival happening anyway. So there certainly seems to be in Britain and America. I'm not so sure about Canada, but I think that it has become evident to a lot of people that it isn't actually possible to, societies need religion, and that Christianity is, I think, the very best option we have. And that sounds, it sounds sort of cynical to say. I'm not making a purely instrumental argument for saying that we should pretend to believe in this thing so that we can, our societies can flourish. But I think that even Richard Dawkins is conceding this now. I think that new atheism has been pretty thoroughly repudiated at this point.
We will at some point switch over to questions from the audience, so I hope people are thinking of those things that they wish to ask Louise. I definitely see you as someone who has shifted the Overton window. I think Peter alluded to this. I think you've created space for people to think about these issues in new and different ways. And for that, I'm very grateful. I have the opportunity to say that to you publicly. I wondered if you were ever truly very nervous in some of the things that you've written and said publicly, or do you see yourself as brave? Because I see you as brave, but do you?
So I kind of I think that the reason it was easier to be brave was because I pulled the Band-Aid off already before writing this book by being opposed to transgenderism, which I was critical of for like a really long time. I mean, even as an undergraduate, when it was really, really not the done thing. And I because of that, like, I lost the friends I was going to lose. And I cut off the professional opportunities that I was going to cut off. And so I'd kind of done it. And so when it got to the point of saying other controversial things, I thought, well, I don't have any more professional opportunities or friends to lose, so I might as well. Which is, I have never been cancelled. I've actually really not suffered much at all. Compared with, I have friends who've, the hardest thing to do is to be publicly on the left and then move and start criticizing ideas that are sacrosanct on the left. By the time I never entered public life on the left. So by the time I was writing as a journalist or whatever, I'd already made that ideological transition. So there was never a feeling of public betrayal of my former comrades. And that is actually the thing that will get you like the most severely cancelled, and the most that's when you'll attract the most obsessive hate. So I was, I guess, lucky in that regard. So I honestly feel like, compared with people I know who've really suffered from cancellation, I'm not brave. And I mean, to my surprise, most of my arguments have ended up being really well received.
Indeed. I hope that you also found new friends as you lost the ones you were going to lose. I'm sure you did.
Yeah.
So back to where we began with the sexual revolution, most typical revolutions, French, American, Velvet Revolution, Czech Republic, they have a start and an end. They have dates that we can learn in school. I'm really curious to know where you think we are at in this sexual revolution that is ongoing. Has it peaked? Where are we at? What dates will future children in school learn for the sexual revolution started by the birth control pill?
Yeah, interesting. There probably is some date like related to the pill, which might, in retrospect, seem to be very important. I don't know it off the top of my head though. I mean, I would have said like Roe v. Wade, but then of course that's been reversed. So, I mean, the pill isn't going to be uninvented.
Isn't going to be, sorry?
Uninvented.
No.
I suppose there might be a scenario in the future where we can't make it for some reason, that there's some, we deindustrialize and it's no longer possible to produce this technology. That seems like a remote possibility though, and ditto with the internet. Can't uninvent the internet, short of unplugging everything.
But with regards to other issues as well, so say the transgender revolution has really walked further, I guess, than I would have thought 20 years ago it could go. Is that going to continue, or are we at sort of a point at which we're, sanity will prevail and that will begin to reverse?
Well, I think the backlash is already underway for the sexual revolution. I did predict this at the end of the book, which I must have written that 4 or 5 years ago now, that conclusion, that we would see young people in particular, like at the time I was writing, the trad wife phenomenon was very nascent and has since become much more well known. And the move to, particularly of men, but not just of men, also women, towards the right and the signs of Christian revival and so on, that's all come in the last few years, really. And I think that's definitely evidence of a backlash against all of this. I mean, Donald Trump is an evidence of a backlash against all of this as well. Not that he's not, despite what his critics hope or think, he's not a sign of impending Gilead, Handmaid's Tale kind of, he's actually not a pious person at all. But J.D. Vance is. So, I mean, we're seeing political movements which were unthinkable, I think, well, maybe not unthinkable, but certainly seemed unlikely in, say, the 1990s. And that's a kind of natural, there's a natural cyclical nature to these things, which you see throughout history. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that we're seeing a reaction against the sexual revolution. But it's never an undoing. It's always just a further layer on top of the history.
Is J.D. Vance a sign of religious revival?
Well, if he wins the presidency, I suppose he will be. I don't know.
Okay, we will move on to questions very soon, I think, but just to ask you another, or not, nearing the end of our questions here, do you have advice to different types of people, those setting out who don't yet have families, they're not yet married and they don't have families, and advice regarding the cost of a culture without limits for those who do already have families and are working away in our sexual revolution world? I guess let's start with those who don't yet have families. Any advice for them?
This is probably the most common and most difficult question I get, and because I don't have an easy kind of prescription.
Just tell them to buy your book.
Yeah, would that it were so easy. I think that the good news about this historical event that we've all lived through is that you can choose differently, and people do often choose differently. Like you'll face there'll be social consequences, and it's not the path of least resistance, to put it lightly. But there is actually a lot of space for agency within a culture where, it's not like waiting till marriage is illegal. Not yet, right? It is possible for people to choose to do the more traditional thing, and people do. And J.D. Vance is an example of a traditional Catholic who is, I know women, whenever people say, it's completely impossible to have children in this economic climate, whatever, I say, I know women who have 8 children, 7 children, women with degrees and jobs who've done this. I mean, it's really hard, and you'll be really tired, and you won't be able to go on a holiday all the time. Obviously the costs are there. It's not like this stuff is easy, but of course you can. And I guess it's just about finding within your own circumstances, which will always be different, it's about finding that space for agency and thinking like what is actually within my power to do differently in a way that I think would make my life better and my children's lives better. And I think there is almost always some space for agency.
Also, for those families raising kids today, any thoughts or advice for them?
Well, I mean, I tell myself all the time that the period in the trenches is brief. And the days are long, but the years are short is very good advice. And that the biological window that you have to do this is constrained in a way that other windows are not constrained. Your career can wait in a way that your reproduction can't. And so sometimes that does mean like being poorer than you would otherwise have been, and being more tired than you'd otherwise have been. But life is long, and you're going to maybe spend, I mean, it's, again, so I can't afford it, I can't find the right person, 2 most common reasons for not having children. But the third is sleep deprivation. I'm like, guys, you're going to be like, worst case scenario, you have a child who sleeps really badly until they're 2. You have one child, you're going to live for 80 years, maybe more. I mean, just think rationally about the proportion of your life which you'll spend being tired. I can't. The short-termism, I think, is terrible, but it is unfortunately encouraged within the culture. So try and look to the longer horizon, I suppose.
Excellent advice. I'm sure you've heard of Catherine Pacaluk.
Oh yeah, I interviewed her a year or 2 ago.
I think she has, well, many children. Questions from the audience then? One over in the corner there.
Thanks so much. Really, really appreciate Louise and Andrea. Great conversation. Speaking of technologies, one of the myths or sort of persistent backup options that is often suggested to young women my age who are, pursuing a career and, highly encouraged to delay child rearing and childbearing until they've advanced sufficiently in their career is the idea of egg freezing or relying down the line on assisted human reproduction technologies. And I see some interesting insights from labor market economics on this. A lot of companies that want to see women in the workforce longer, of course, are highly enthused by this prospect that they won't have to, have part of their workforce on hold for a number of those years. They can keep them in longer, extract more value until they inevitably go off and have some major life transformation. But similarly, I see debate on the right about this, on what good public policy solutions are, whether we should be, given the trajectories and trends that we're seeing in fertility, whether we should be encouraging this and governments to support it financially, putting pressure on insurance companies, for example, to provide funding for this, or alternatively, whether this should be disencouraged because it actually delays a process that technology is entirely solved for if you wait too long. Curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, you said it on the corporate incentives to offer women egg freezing packages. I think that anyone with women's interests at heart should be highly skeptical of this. The corporate incentives are so clearly towards encouraging women to delay as much as possible. And it is this unfortunate fact that your peak reproductive years are also the years where you can be most energetic at work, kind of not coincidentally, right? Which is just difficult, inherently it's difficult for everyone. But I think that egg freezing, my understanding of the data on this, I'm no expert, but that IVF can work well if your fertility problem is unrelated to your age. But it's very, the results are very disappointing when it's age-related infertility. And I don't think that that's very well understood. And you'll see statistics on, we have them on the London Underground for IVF services, and they'll quote statistics on success rates, and they really are quite misleading because it doesn't mean that you can wait until you're in your mid-40s or something and be guaranteed a live birth. It really doesn't. So, sometimes people respond to this by saying, "Oh, women aren't stupid; they know this." And I think, it doesn't require stupidity to not be aware of this. It mostly requires complacency and I guess also a degree of self-deception because it seems so unfair, and it is like cosmically unfair that men can have children into old age even, and women have this really quite short window.
I think the Atlantic Monthly just ran a lengthy article talking about how little women know about their child rearing potential or fertility window, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
It's common.
Something that people don't know, I only discovered this a couple of years ago, which is so interesting, is that if you have had children before, you remain fertile for longer. And that might be to do with women. It's also the case that women who have children later in life tend to live longer. So it might be...
Excellent.
Well, it might just be an indication of your health in general. So if you... Because your fertility can sort of be a canary in the coal mine, that if you're... Because it's such a complex system, it might fail first of all of your other systems. And so if you're struggling to conceive, that could be indicative of having other health problems. And obviously if you have other health problems, you might have a shortened lifespan. So it's kind of hard to disentangle. But I think it is the case. And actually there are stories about this actually of women who will have an IVF first baby and then they'll naturally conceive their second baby because for some reason the body, like once it's done it once, it does it better. So, I mean, just anecdotally, I know of women who had their 5th, 6th, 7th babies in their mid-40s because their body just knew exactly what to do, whereas trying to conceive your first at that age is much harder. And it's always been the case. I mean, people, again, they can talk in slightly alarmist tones about like, oh, gosh, women in their 40s, they're so decrepit, they couldn't possibly carry a baby to term, So no, women have always been having children actually the birth rate. I know in America, Lyman Stone has written about this, the birth rate for 43-year-old women, so women who are really on the cusp of perimenopause, is lower now than it was 100 years ago. So the idea that the reason women aren't having more children is because they're butting up against the biological limit doesn't actually seem to be true. Women are probably choosing to stop earlier than they might otherwise. And our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers, they just, because they didn't have contraception, they just kept having children until they couldn't anymore. And that did sometimes mean having children quite old. So I guess, I mean, I read about this all the time and I'm still discovering new facts. So I think that the idea that everyone has completely perfect education on this is clearly not true. And a lot of businesses have an incentive to I don't want to say tell lies, that's a bit strong, but to present a particular interpretation of the data which serves their interests.
Mm-hmm. On this side.
Just on the subject of no-fault divorce, I was just curious what you would make of the notion that a lot of the abuses that a woman might face in a marriage are very difficult to and psychologically distressing to prove legally, and that if you repealed no-fault divorce, it might result in kind of the prolonging of a lot of those unhappy marriages.
I guess that would be the strongest argument in favour of having no-fault divorce. Although the more common one is that it makes it swifter and cheaper, which I think is surely true because lawyers aren't required in order to go through this process of discerning who is at fault and who isn't. But then equally, I think that if a woman actually this is a strong argument. You could also say that if a woman has been, or indeed a man, has been mistreated terribly by their spouse, that deserves to be recognised, like formally recognised, and they deserve to have whatever compensation is available within the finances. And actually that, in a way, saying us officially attributing there being no fault in that relationship is, I think, also wrong. I can understand how the individuals might not want to go through the process, but I actually think that one of the functions that law serves is to make moral claims, and those include, if you mistreat your spouse, then that is wrong. We condemn that, and that can have subtle effects on individual behaviour. But I do think that given that the state is forced to make moral adjudications all the time, that should extend to marriages.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for what was a very thought-provoking conversation. I've been scribbling down notes at the back here. of some of what you've been saying. I want to ask a question, which has been rattling in the back of my mind while you've been speaking. You mentioned the M word, modernity, and said that was, I think, on a number of occasions, you said the cultural challenges that the relations between the sexes face are bigger than simple issues of public policy. In other words, public policy is downstream of culture. So I want to pose this question to you, and I kind of apologize for doing it because I think you were skirting around it, and I haven't read your book. You may have addressed it in your book. It's this proposition: the crisis of the sexes is a crisis of individualism that has become pathological, which is but individualism is the inevitable organizing principle of the Enlightenment. So that the crisis of the sexes that we're witnessing in the late 20th and early 21st century is actually a subset of the crisis of the Enlightenment. I wonder if you can address that, and I apologize for throwing a big hairy question out at you, but it's vexing me as we talk about this issue, because I think you've said that public policy is downstream of the cultural question, which is downstream of the philosophical question.
It intuitively would make sense that the battle of the sexes would be born from individualism, in the sense that it encourages people to be selfish. But the only problem with that is that these coordination problems with matchmaking and reproduction are also evident in societies that aren't very individualistic. They're kind of evident everywhere. So South Korea would be a good example of this. South Korea is a very collectivist culture, which is much less tolerant of eccentricity and of people defying social convention. And they have famously the lowest birth rate in the world. And by all accounts, I've never been to South Korea. I would like to. And incredibly hostile relations between the sexes that play out in popular culture and so on. So that would seem to be a counterexample which suggests that individualism is really an invention of the English. Like I say, this is I don't say this to be self-aggrandizing, but and this is literally the standard historical account is that individualism was invented in about 13th century England, in the sense that it was a break with clannishness and with the importance of the extended kin network, and then that got exported to Canada and elsewhere, and has become the dominant ideological mode only because America dominates the world. But even in places where the extended family is still very central to people's lives and where politics operates in much more clannish ways, they still seem to be having this problem, which suggests to me that it isn't really to do with the ideology, it's something else. I mean, my leading theory, which I'll expound in this book, is that it's actually more to do with living in conditions of great safety and of very, very low mortality. That the main way in which modern societies are radically different from others, and this applies just as much to South Korea as to Iran, as to Canada, or wherever, is our mortality rates are so low, particularly our child mortality rates, that people just live so much longer and more safe and secure lives. And that's obviously an amazing blessing, and no one wants to undo that. But I think that there's a deep way in which it messes with our psychology and our desire to do difficult things like having children. I think that actually when you're living in riskier settings where you're constantly surrounded by reminders of death and of violence and of peril, perversely, people seem to be more, there's more vitality in people. People are actually more willing to have children and to take risks of all kinds. And then the flip side is that we are so bizarrely, like we have never been more materially lucky. Like no people in the history of the world have been as lucky as we are in terms of our access to food and warmth and comfort and everything. And yet people are, there's like a collective nervous breakdown happening across the West. It's so strange. And I think, yeah, it must be something about modernity that kind of messes with us. But I'm still rooting for modernity. I would much rather that we found a way around this. I feel like surely there's a way that we can just psychologically adjust and still enjoy all the pleasures of not having our children die in infancy. But
we have a question up here and then one in the corner here. So we'll hear first and then to this corner.
Just on the question again on no-fault divorces. As the younger generation, we live in a generation of divorces, as you said, we see it all around us. And would you say that when the young generation is very aware of the possibility of divorce and how it's a real thing, that the removal of such a thing almost disincentivizes marriage because it's a contract that's even harder to leave, so it will actually make marriage rates even lower than it is now because people are even more scared to get into something like that they know doesn't really last as long as it used to?
yeah, it would, if you want marriage rates to rise, you have to stigmatize premarital sex. We didn't talk about that as a policy question because it's a bit tricky, but like that's kind of that's the big reason why people are not motivated to get married now. It's because you don't have to get married to have sex. I think if that, and that's not really, I mean, I suppose theoretically the state could criminalize premarital sex, but that I'm not proposing that. But again, this is the pill. Like the pill made it normal for people to have sex without expecting pregnancy to be the consequence. And once people have permanently adjusted their view of what sex is and what it's for, it's actually like really countercultural to say, like, you know what sex is for? I did an interview recently with Bonnie Blue, who you probably don't know who she is, which is maybe for the best. She's like Britain's most famous OnlyFans star. And I asked her, like, what is sex for? And she said, it's a hobby, it's fun. And that's the mainstream view. Like she's unusually clear about that, but that's the mainstream view. And I think it's very hard to have the traditional marriage model in a culture where sex being a fun hobby is the mainstream view.
We'll take a question in this corner here, and then.
Hi, I have thoughts about language and policy. Can we reclaim the word work? Work is doing something that's productive, whether it's waged or unwaged. And so when we talk about working mothers, well, as we say, every mother is a working mother, and that was a feminist slogan that's been dropped, but it's still a slogan. And when you say stay-at-home mother, I'm just going to request that you not say that term, because I've never met a stay-at-home mother. I mean, you're not a stay-at-home mother. I've never was. It's women are working unless they're dead or comatose, if they're mothers, period. And on the policy, what this ties in is the GDP. The GDP is structured, it ignores all the unwaged work, and it only counts anything that's commodified. And the person who invented the GDP as a government policy, Simon Kuznets, in the 1920s in the US, he recognized that his measure was not a measure of social good or even the productivity of the society. And he said that housewives and others are very productive. And he spent much of his life trying to reverse how the GDP was misused. But there has been a big move. Joseph Stiglitz, one of the world's top economists, beyond GDP. So Because right now, the right and the left, all those parties all want to grow the economy, which actually means they want to grow the GDP. But if we all got cancer, we all got divorced, and we all, whatever, the GDP would go up, even though society would go down. So that's a policy measure that's structural, that affects every decision, like maybe not every single decision that's in the society. And so suggesting and working towards measures other than the GDP, which is a useless measure, like literally you get cancer, there's a mass murder, the GDP there never is no subtraction with the GDP. But if you raise kids who are good and solid and grow gardens and all the rest of it, doesn't count for anything. So the GDP and redoing that is, what do you think of that?
I was going to say we need to morph it into a question. So do you agree? Or
I think on the language point, stay-at-home, there's a bit of a euphemism treadmill when it comes to stay-at-home mothers. Like that's the new term that was previous, that has replaced housewife, that has replaced homemaker. And all of these terms kind of are constantly trying to outrun the stigmatization. And there's nothing, like, I personally think the homemaker is probably like the nicest actually of those terms, like making a home, but women objected to housewife because they said, I'm not married to my house. Like fine, but I think that what we're seeing there is this process of, I think linguists call it pejoration, like something becoming pejorative. Pejoration process is often indicative of something being considered low status. Like if a term is constantly, well, if the thing that the term describes is constantly attracting pejoration, if as soon as you use it, Germaine Greer said this years ago, that words that, if you look at the history, because she was an English literature specialist before she was a public feminist, words that are exclusively used to describe women tend to go through a process of pejoration over time. Like mistress used to be a neutral term, and then it became a stigmatized term for the other woman. And I think tart is the same. Like she has a list of these probably in the female eunuch. And I think that can be a sign of what like society actually thinks about that. So I think actually that the fact that we're having to battle over the least offensive terms to describe women who don't do paid work but look after their children primarily is a sign of how society actually regards that. Which I think is, I obviously think is lamentable, and has unfortunately been driven by feminism as much as anything else in recent decades.
We're going to go with, I think, one more question, and I had noticed your hand, so arbitrarily we'll choose.
I hope I don't disappoint with the last question. So. Yeah, I watched your interview with Bonnie Blue, and Louise, I have to say, I'm a horror movie junkie, but I didn't think I was going to get through the whole interview because it was kind of terrifying. I just wanted to ask you a question about how you felt at one point. The moderator was asking her about how she felt and was pressing her on this, having her parents at this movie viewing. And he kept on pressing and saying, but how do you feel? And she would give an answer, and he would say, but that's not a feeling. And you, in your book, you say 1 in 26 women in the UK are into this OnlyFans business of sorts. And I want to ask you, what do you think she was trying to say but unable to say on camera about how she felt? What does she feel? And what do you think a lot of women feel who are in a similar position as her, but are just not able to say it for whatever reason?
So I think that Bonnie really is an outlier. As I said in the conversation, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to speak to her, because I think that she is so psychologically strange. She doesn't really accept that characterization, but she sort of does actually. I think that she actually doesn't feel much in the way of shame, which is what one would expect to feel in that setting if your family are watching like hardcore images of you. And that's one of the reasons why she's ended up doing what she does. But that's very rare, and I think that most women, including some of the other like big names in British pornography like Lily Phillips, do feel negative emotions, including shame and disgust. I mentioned in the book that there isn't really a word for sexual fear and disgust. There isn't a single word for that, but it's an emotion that I think every woman I've spoken to about this has felt at least once. The simultaneous kind of recoiling from a threatening man in some way. And yeah, there isn't a word for it, and I think that maybe we do lack the vocabulary sometimes to talk about the instinctively negative feeling that women have towards feelings of sexual violation. But yeah, maybe Bonnie doesn't have that. I don't know. I mean, that's why you're always going to have outliers. And any generalizations you make about the sexes psychologically, I mean, I do always try and impress. We're talking about overlapping bell curves. There are exceptions in every sense. And sometimes you have women like Bonnie Blue, who I think are 1 in a billion in terms of their emotional responses, which is why she can do what she does. But that doesn't mean that she isn't doing any harm. She might not be harming herself by doing what she's doing, but I think she's harming the culture.
I wanted to thank you very much for coming to Canada. And I would like to recommend The Case Against the Sexual Revolution to each one of you, as well as Maiden Mother Matriarch, as listening to advance your thinking on these important issues. So thank you once again, Louise.
Thank you so much, Angela.